You're listening to the Biohackers World podcast.
We are back live from Biohackers World in Chicago. I'm Josh Black, host of Becoming Young podcast, and I am here today with Brendan. Brendan, say your last name for me so I don't
Vermeire, yeah.
Vermeire, okay, all right. Brendan Vermeire. Brendan, we're going to talk metabolism and neuroinflammation today, but before we get into the details on that, tell me a little bit about how your journey got you from sort of where you were in life into caring about all this biohacking and optimizing the body.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for having me. And I have a feeling that we have a lot in common based on our off-air conversation there, so I'm sure we could kind of nerd out for hours. But you know, my story is a little eclectic. When I was a senior in high school, I was really locked onto this idea of I wanted to become a Navy SEAL. I grew up doing martial arts. I fell in love with Bushido and these Japanese philosophies, kind of the way of the warrior, if you will. And so for me, samurai translated to Navy SEAL in kind of modern American times. And I poured everything I had into that. And I would say hindsight, now that I'm a 33-year-old man and have a little bit more life wisdom and maturity, I think I was a high-functioning, depressed young man trying to find his way. So I think it's kind of one of those, my heart was in the right place, but not my head. And so then I was about 3 weeks into Spec Ops boot camp. I wasn't in BUDS, I wasn't in Hell Week or anything cool like that, but I was in the Navy SEAL pipeline, and they found I had a hernia that needed surgery, so they medically discharged me, and that kind of sent me into this bit of a young life crisis of what do I do with myself. And I already worked at the gym, and all I did was work out and train for the hardest military training in the world. So then I was given the opportunity to become a personal trainer, nutrition coach, and metabolic technician. And once I started studying that information, the metabolic physiology and biochemistry, I fell in love with the science, and I also fell in love with the service and helping people. So even as an 18-year-old brand new trainer, nutrition coach, I was doing VO2 testing, resting metabolic rate, blood work to have a more science-backed objective approach to optimizing health and fitness. And then here we are like 15 years later, and now I'm doing all this cool stuff in the functional medicine space. So that's kind of the short version of a very long journey.
No, that's great. So you were on the front end, sort of like me, right? You were on the front end, maybe even earlier, you were on the front end of sort of this really testing and diagnostics, right? So tell me, why specifically did you find sort of yourself being drawn to metabolism, and what interested you about that?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I never would have thought, 15 years later, having started my career that way, that someday I'd be really focused on neuroimmunology and microglial activation, neuroinflammation, all these things, because it really started where, as a young trainer and nutrition coach, of course, all my clients were kind of average Americans, middle-class individuals trying to lose weight, get in shape, right? And of course, how do individuals like that want to measure progress? Of course, the weight loss, the scale. But that's such a crude metric of health, right? And even I worked for Lifetime, which is an amazing corporation, and they've always had this sort of functional medicine element to their business model at scale. So they've always had lab testing and metabolic testing. But I was just so fascinated by the science of the human body. And even when I was pursuing the Navy SEAL aspirations, I thought it was a really helpful life skill to know, how do I optimize my metabolic machinery? How do I optimize recovery and nutrition for the sake of performance? But then it was around this time, 18 and 21, even though I was very metabolically fit and helping others with their metabolic health, I was really struggling mentally. And so then I went through this whole healing crisis. I attempted suicide. I lost a loved one to suicide. And that's kind of what put me on the path of now my whole career is teaching functional medicine for mental health. So it seems kind of odd when you hear the high level, but when you look at the step-by-step journey, it was a very organic segue.
I'm sorry to hear that. It's interesting because we could do a whole other podcast on men's mental health and sort of the expectations of society and what the way that we should be talking or not talking about things. So let's real quick just sort of take one step down.
Sure.
And let's talk about what do we mean by metabolic health? Because I think we see a lot of that now, like, hey, we need to be metabolically healthy. We talk about people having, being pre-diabetic or type 2 diabetes, and that, I think that's a lot of times the lens, which a lot of folks look at that, but it's actually a little bit more nuanced than that. So how would you describe, what being metabolically healthy actually means?
Well, I think we need a better definition and better standards, right? When we look at 88% of Americans are considered metabolically compromised, and that data, that statistic eclectic is based on relatively crude metrics of health, right? And I know those crude metrics, like they're kind of mass populist, they're palatable compared to like fancy biomarkers that you don't know what they are really. But certainly when we look at all the different mechanisms, whether it's the HPA axis or the blood sugar dysregulation, mitochondrial function, all these cool mechanistic things, but ultimately I think we can just think of your metabolism as the engine that propels your meat suit through this beautiful journey that is life, right? And so certainly it's like, I love seeing this emerging concept of metabolic psychiatry and muscle as medicine. And for me, it's almost ironic and paradoxical because, you know, when I was an 18-year-old fitness professional, there was kind of this stigma of like, well, we're just knuckle dragging trainers. Like, we're not doctors, stay in our lane. But then here we are 15 years later, now it's like all the leading experts in functional medicine are like, oh, actually you should work out and eat clean and have purpose to your existence, right? And there's all these deeper holistic elements to what sculpts our metabolism, but also our psyche, our mind, our spirit as well. So I would argue we can't really have an optimal mental phenotype without an optimal metabolic engine that's propelling us forward. And that opens up whole conversation on metabolic psychiatry and root cause factors.
I think it's really interesting. So I was just at SSRP, which is the peptide conference. Well, it's a peptide congress, which is also a conference.
Right.
But last month, I think. And there was some really great mitochondrial breakout sessions, which I was super dorking out about, right? But I think the interesting thing for a lot of the audience is, you know, we only get taught some of this stuff in like 8th grade and 9th grade biology, right? And so I know on my own journey, as I have really gotten deep into this, I'm sort of like, why didn't anybody tell me? I mean, why didn't anybody tell me that I needed to be paying attention to mitochondria, right? Why didn't anybody sort of like bring it back to the basics? Right. So how did you get from really understanding the basics to developing a panel to measure, and what were you really trying to measure? Yeah,
well, when I was trying to help my original personal training, nutrition coaching clients, health coaching clients, right? And it was all very fitness, nutrition, and really looking at, of course, not just their body weight, but their body fat percentage and even more sensitive metrics like the max VO2. And I love that now, you know, your max VO2 is being touted as an anti-aging longevity biomarker, because if we're talking about mitochondria, what do mitochondria do? They consume oxygen to create cellular energy, right? And if you look at, well, what is VO2 max? It's the maximum amount of the volume of oxygen your body can consume under strenuous exercise. So how much oxygen is your whole body, all of its constituent cells, and thousands of mitochondria, hundreds to thousands of mitochondria per cell? You know, if we want a net global marker of mitochondrial function, it doesn't get better than the VO2 max. And so then you look at, well, the mitochondrial theory of mental illness, that's its own whole theory. Most people are only familiar with the monoamine theory, which is the brain chemical imbalance, which is largely marketing rhetoric that's been used for big pharma selling their neuropsychiatric drugs. But then there's the mitochondrial theory, gut-brain axis. So especially when we look at, well, how do we optimize mitochondrial function? Everybody's looking at alpha-ketoglutaric acid or NAD. And it's like, whoa, back up. Sunlight, exercise, right? How do you stimulate mitogenesis? Lift weights, move your body, get in the sunlight. So I think it brings us back to holistic foundations, and then we can use advanced biomarkers to kind of redirect them to the lifestyle principles. And so along the way, I just got deeper into all these fancy biomarkers, and especially with brain on fire, neuroinflammation, neuroimmunology, we have so many amazing biomarkers that are largely available but not accessible. The conventional system isn't using them to keep their costs low. Functional medicine providers don't really know about them. So I think we're just missing out on using validated tools to help guide people back to optimal neurolongevity, so to speak.
So did this test sort of become your way of taking your favorite markers and packaging them up so that you could share them with the world?
Essentially. At that point in time, I was really niched into the mold illness and chronic Lyme space. I had this whole vendetta against mold illness, and it was one of those things that as I did my rounds through that space of the functional medicine industry, I saw a lot of confusion and chaos. The practitioners seemed confused and overwhelmed. The consumers felt and patients felt very lost and confused. So I was really digging into the research of, well, what biomarkers have a lot of clinical validity and research behind them to show what they do and do not mean, and how can we use that to objectively navigate complex chronic illness? Because some of these individuals with Lyme, mold, POTS, MCAS, so on and so forth, they believe that they're too sensitive to take anything, and sometimes the narrative that they've been told or they're telling themselves doesn't align well with the objective physiological data. And so I like to bring it back to objective truth, and I think we have to make sure we're tracking physiology so we don't get lost in the chase of root causes.
Yeah, I mean, I think we sort of get lost in the chase of a lot of things, right? In optimizing body, I mean, data, I mean, we're going to be doing a panel, I'm going to be moderating a panel this afternoon, talking a little bit about sort of what this means overall, because the industry has sort of shifted, right? We went from, in general, we went from testing a lot of different things, and then big data came, right? And so then we started consuming massive amounts of data, but to what end, right? Like there is a more is not better sort of scenario. So tell me, as a watcher or a listener, what should people be caring about? So you sort of, you're here telling everybody, we've got these different, everything's connected in our body, everything, right? Every system's connected to every other system. We've got peptides and hormones and things signaling on processes and what to do and how much to make and when to turn off, and we've got these things, and then we have imbalances, and when the imbalances, that can cause depression, and it doesn't have to be an imbalance necessarily in the brain, it can be connected. So what can somebody who is a biohacker or somebody who is interested in optimizing, not only their biological process, but their mental acuity, their mood, right? What do they need to pay attention to?
Well, honestly, I'm a big fan of simplicity. I was just having a webinar conversation with a good friend of mine the other day, and we were talking about the biological age tests and, their calculations or estimations based on relatively rudimentary blood chemistry markers or then methylation DNA patterns to kind of...
I have very strong opinions on this, but we'll leave that be.
Well, I kind of do too, and we were essentially talking about how clinically valid is this kind of biological age thing, and not really, is the punchline. But ultimately, I can appreciate that, consumers, the masses, they want one metric, something easy to track. So I can see the appeal and the attraction in sort of this estimated biological age, because it's not practical for everybody to become like an advanced biomarker analysis expert.
For sure.
That's a high quality even in the functional medicine space. So ultimately, though, think about like the centurions and the blue zones. Do you think the centurions in Okinawa are like monitoring their HRV every day? And
they're not wearing a whoop.
Yeah, I don't think they're too worried about it. I think they're too busy living their ikigai, living their purpose, serving their community and the collective, and living the holistic foundations, meaningful relationships and community, spending plenty of time outside in the soil, breathing in their microbiota, so on and so forth. So I always like to kind of use the enchantment of the gadgets, the gizmos, the fancy tests, and well, hey, what if we simplify and motivational interview the person to kind of stop chasing data that might be confusing and misleading? It's like, well, let's focus on taking action that's actually going to move the needle on your psychological and physiological well-being right here, right now.
So what is one thing that has surprised you the most as you were digging into creating your own panel of markers, right, and understanding, because you're going to be unique just like I am in your understanding and the way that you have put together your shared knowledge, right, of all these different things. What has been one of the more surprising things to you that you've learned in this space of the biology and connectedness?
There's so many layers to it, and I think the deeper I get into it, it's we all have our genetic predispositions, right? And then of course we all understand the concept of epigenetics, of how our external, internal, psycho-emotional environment is going to alter genetic expression.
Well, let's just explain what that is for a second, just in case folks aren't, right?
Using myself as an example, I seem to have a genetic predisposition to ADHD and depression. I was diagnosed ADHD and major depressive disorder right before my suicide attempt at 21. And I experienced firsthand how dysfunctional the conventional approach to mental health is. But in a lot of ways, I think a lot of people fail to really define what does mental health mean to them? What does it look like to them? What does it feel like for them? And I think they get caught up in the commercialization of the gadgets and the tests and whatnot. And it's like, well, let's bring it back to understanding that mental health is kind of this complex mixture of physiological function and psychological well-being, and you can't really separate that. But I do think we kind of have to delineate for the sake of understanding well, hey, what psychological healing opportunities are there present? Is there unresolved trauma or adverse childhood events, or you're in, an emotionally abusive financial relationship or whatever it might be, and separating those stressors that might be impacting our biology, but still maintaining, well, the physiology and the biology is over here. So that way, for example, if somebody has metabolic inflammation and, elevated inflammatory markers, we can't change their genetics, but if the inflammation is exacerbating the predisposition and propensity towards ADHD or OCD or schizophrenia, we may not be able to fix the genes or cure that condition, but we can improve the phenotype. We can improve the epigenetics. We can decrease that fire that's essentially driving symptomatology. So at least they have a more optimal version of whatever their natural rhythm is, if that makes sense.
Yep. So in other words, right, if you're going to take and drive a car, if you're going to redline that car, you have a greater chance of burning out the engine, right? As opposed to if you maybe just back it off a little bit, you can still end up going 80 miles an hour, just maybe accelerate a little bit slower, right? And so you can sort of protect the engine a little bit. That's a little bit of a crude analogy, but it works, right? So you've got this blood test. Tell me a little bit. I'm out of my morbid curiosity. Tell me a little bit about what you're testing for and why it's important.
Yeah, well, this is what blows my mind is never in my educational journey was it really taught to me of like, okay, there's clinically validated biomarkers and then there's all these kind of functional tests that, might be experimental. Like just because we can measure something doesn't mean we really know the clinical significance of that data point.
Right.
And that's an important thing to delineate, right? And so then, of course, when you look at the conventional model, there actually are things in place to discourage superfluous lab testing. They're trying to keep their costs low. Insurance doesn't want to pay for any testing that's not deemed medically necessary. So some of these markers that are related to neuronal damage or brain cell damage and turnover, like why would you order that on a patient that isn't presenting with clear neurological dysfunction, right? They're expensive markers. Now, ultimately, though, looking at some of these markers, I always think starting with basic blood work, full CMP, CBC, lipid panel, iron, ferritin, C-reactive protein, homocysteine. These are just basic markers I think everybody should be tracking at least once per year, if not twice per year. And again, that's tracking physiology, not chasing the root causes of like doing serial mycotoxin tests of how many mycotoxins came out this time. But what does that mean in relation to your physiology and biochemistry? So for individuals struggling with their mental health, though, I do think there's a number of emerging, newer comprehensive markers that can really either affirm that there is something going on that hasn't yet been detected or caught, that then, imagine if we were using these markers more prophylactically, how much dementia could we prevent in the population? I don't know, it's hypothetical. But if we don't give people access to these markers so they can objectively assess their neuroimmunology or physiology, they'll never really know, right? So I think it's very empowering.
So what are the markers?
Well, some of my favorites, there's one called neurofilament light chain. So this is kind of like the troponin of heart health, but for the brain. It's a marker of axon injury to the brain cells. So we can look at that as an end product of, is there anything that's insulting the brain to the point that there's more brain cell damage, whether it's like a TBI or hypoxia or neuroinflammation. There's another marker called glial fibrillary acidic protein. It's a marker of astrocyte activation, neuroinflammation in leaky brain. So there's some that are more neurospecific, and then there's others that are a little bit more peripheral, like neopterin is a marker of macrophage activation, or galectin-3 for inflammation and fibrosis, glyc-A. Homocysteine is a big marker that I think that one's pretty standard and very methylation dependent. But those are just a few of my favorites that kind of come to mind.
So do we have data, like if we were to take and overlay data on, on centenarians or as folks get older, do we know what that normal range is? If we haven't done a lot of testing on these markers, right, just compared to the Gen Pop, right? We've got millions, hundreds of millions of data sets, right, for a standard panel, right? What kind of data set do we have to be able to understand what these levels do as we age?
Really good question, and that's actually kind of the crux of the research that I'm doing, and probably what I'll do for the rest of my career, because like the biological age we were talking about, the pheno age, that was based on NHANES data of like N of 9,300 people.
Right.
And based on the kind of basic blood biomarkers, because that's what we have the most data on, everybody's doing a CMP, CBC.
Right.
So that's very standard. We have copious amounts of that data, where some of these newer markers, like neurofilament light chain, was originally really researched for multiple sclerosis, but it's not specific to multiple sclerosis. That's just the autoimmune event that's creating the neuronal damage that then is measured by the neurofilament light chain. So then they're like, oh, multiple sclerosis, that was great. What about Parkinson's? What about dementia and Alzheimer's? Well, what about depression? Because we know depression could, depending on the context, have a neuroinflammatory component. So we don't yet have all the optimal ranges. So
that was going to be my next question, sort of how you come up with that.
There's the conventional reference range that comes from LabCorp, and they'll do a Z-score depending on the age of the individual. So if somebody's 60, that's going to be a different potential score than somebody in their 20. But that's some of the research I hope to help establish is, well, but what should this biomarker be doing over the course of life? Because we know as the neurodegeneration is creeping up, that marker will continue to increase.
Okay, so I'm gonna be controversial and ask one question here since we're coming to the end.
Absolutely.
So there's a lot of noise, right, in the space around alternative therapies for TBIs, depression, things like psilocybin, or some of the there's a whole shelf, right, of things like that. Have you seen any early data on how those types of therapies might impact positively or negatively some of these biomarkers?
That's exactly the research I want to do through my foundation. And so ultimately, peptides and psychedelics are my most passionate intervention, shall we say. I mean, there's so many amazing peptides that we don't know. We don't have human data. It's preclinical for most of them, in vivo rat models and whatnot. So we're lacking human data on peptides, psilocybin, psychedelics, that's kind of another thing. But what we really need is that. We need to be looking at these biomarkers that have already been clinically established into these contexts. Because hypothetically, I do believe, let's say you have somebody with Alzheimer's or even early onset Alzheimer's. What happens if you load them up with peptides like KPV or thymosin beta 4, and then you're tracking those biomarkers? That's what I want to find out.
That's fascinating. I love it. We're going to keep in touch because I want to be on the front end of this to know what's happening. I think this is a huge opportunity because I think it's 100%. A place where, you already know this, but I don't know that other folks who are watching understand the gap that exists specifically in this area, right? I think traditional psychiatry and mental health has sort of been pretty lopsided, and I think there is just a lot for us to know.
Absolutely.
So I appreciate the conversation. Thank you for your journey. Thanks for sharing about that, and I would love to have more conversations on this. I think there's more to be had.
Yeah, I appreciate you too.
All right, well, thanks for being with us. We'll talk to you next time.
Come join us at Biohacker Miami, November 1st and 2nd.